Okay. Hopefully you saw my note that these are now available on YouTube, and so some of you are having some difficulty with buffering on streaming the lectures through Loom, so hopefully that will fix part of the problem. I'm also recording this one on campus rather than at my home, hoping that the recording and upload speed is better, and kind of figuring out the recorded lecture thing. So hopefully this is a helpful improvement. Okay, so today we're going to talk about a lot, and I'm going to move kind of quickly and try to get the gist of this information to you without spending like tons and tons of time on each individual artist, which is tricky. But as I've kind of alluded to, in modernism we have so many topics and there's so many things to talk about that it's kind of hard to get into every single thing and give it its due time. So I will do my best. Today, we're going to talk about Cubism, Orphism, and Futurism. Okay, so when we're talking about Cubism, there are two main kinds. You may have seen this in my notes. There's a third thing called crystal Cubism, but that's kind of a later thing, and it's not quite as important in terms of the history of art and the theory behind it. So the two main things are Analytic Cubism and synthetic Cubism. And I'm not going to read to you because you can read. So here on the screen, it explains what these things are. I also talk about it a little bit more in my notes, but we're going to look at examples of both and I'll kind of explain it. Okay, so we'll look at this painting for quite a while because I'm going to talk a little bit more about Cubism in general and then talk about Picasso and then talk about this painting. I happen to love this painting, so I feel like it's a good place to sit while I discuss this stuff with you. Okay, so basically, we're in the 20th century now, and the Expressionist departure from any strict adherence to illusionism, right? So the movement towards more expressive content in artwork rather than simply mimicking what we see in nature. So this is the path that most of the artists moving into the 20th century have kind of decided to follow. There are some people who are still doing realistic representational artwork, of course. There's all different kinds of people making different kinds of work throughout the history of art. But we're going to focus on the people who kind of veer off onto this more expressive path because they're the ones who are doing new and very revolutionary kinds of work. Okay, so this is what's happening in the 20th century. So we have a guy on the scene who I would think that you've all heard of. He's maybe the most famous artist of all time. When people are making some kind of wisecrack about something in the arts, they're usually saying, what, are you some kind of Picasso? That tends to be kind of the reference. So we have Pablo Picasso on the scene in the early 20th century. We're going to talk about him a lot today. We also have George Braque, his less famous but equally important co-inventor of Cubism. So they're among the people who challenge the ideas of traditionalism and kind of disrupt the conventional methods and techniques and concepts behind art in the art world. And the thing that they come up with that's the most disruptive is this idea of cubism, which is the main thing that we're talking about today. So Picasso opens the door to this radical new idea about how forms could be depicted. Basically, it kind of builds on the ideas of Cezanne. Remember in post-impressionism when I talked about Cezanne and how he's important to the Cubists? Well, the thing that he was interested in that is important to the Cubists is this idea about portraying a form, portraying an object or a figure from multiple views simultaneously, from multiple vantage points all at the same time on a flat surface. So he owes a lot, Picasso owes a lot of this innovation to Cezanne and to George Braque for being the one of the two of them who was really focused on what Cezanne had done. So one of the main concepts of Cubism is portraying the dichotomy of three-dimensional space, right, how we are in the world, three-dimensional space, and the modernist conviction that a painting is a two-dimensional design on the flat surface of a canvas. So one of the things we start seeing artists experiment with from the time when we talked about the realists, right, a couple of lectures ago, is they start kind of building in this awareness of the surface of the canvas and of the nature of art itself. That when we're painting, even if we're creating something that looks three-dimensional, it is on a flat surface, it is on a flat plane, and it is two-dimensional. So this is one of the kind of background ideas that's very important to the trajectory of modernism, particularly in painting, but it also ends up affecting how sculpture is then influenced by this development in painting. Okay, so within that dichotomy, we also, with Cubism, have showing multiple sides of an object or figure simultaneously. Basically, it's this investigation of further flattening the three-dimensional real world, okay? So we're flattening this so that it fits onto the two-dimensional reality that is the canvas. And it pushes this idea of representation, right? Of representing, of mimicking what we see in nature. Conceptually, when we are looking at things, after we are babies and we have object permanence develop in our little brains, we know conceptually when we look at an apple on a table that the apple has more than one side, that we just can't see the back of it. We know that objects in space have multiple surfaces that we cannot see from our vantage point. You know that there is a back of my skull holding my brain in right now, even though you just see the front of my face, right? So conceptually, we know that objects have multiple sides, even though we do not see them all at once. So with Cubism, they have the idea of showing all of these sides simultaneously. And in that concept, it's actually maybe more representational of actual reality than representational work that's more like natural art that mimics the natural world, when you think about it, because they're showing everything all at once. So in the concept, it's strange because it has a weird relationship to reality. How about that? It's kind of a little bit of a trippy thought. So basically, this is what the Cubists are interested in. This is what they, in a nutshell, are super interested in. Okay, let's talk about Picasso. Pablo Picasso. He spent most of his life in France, but he is Spanish. He's born in 1881. He dies in 1973. He is born in a small village in Andalusia, Spain, Malaga. He's born in Malaga in 1881. Of course, he's quite famous. He's very prolific. He explores many, many styles throughout his career. We're mostly going to focus on Cubism with him. But basically, he's raised in an environment where he gets exposed to art at a very young age. So his father is also a painter. His father is a painter. He also, at the local museum, does some of the curation at the museum. He also teaches art lessons at the museum and eventually teaches art at the Fine Arts Academy. His dad painted like really natural, realistic paintings of animals, but like animals you shoot, like game animals, like birds that people would hunt and stuff. So his father's famous for that kind of thing. Like he probably would have gotten lots of commissions from the guy that owns Bass Pro, that kind of stuff. Okay. So basically, his dad starts teaching him to draw and paint when he's only like 7 years old. So he starts learning traditional representational kind of work at a very, very young age, and he's very good at it. He's kind of a prodigy. And so then he goes to the School of Fine Arts in Barcelona, and his dad teaches there part of the time. And he starts going to this School of Fine Arts when he's only 13 years old. He then, in 1897, goes to Madrid, and in Madrid he enrolls in Academia de Belles Arts, which is basically the Academy of Fine Arts. It's like the École de Beaux-Arts in Paris, but in Madrid it's the big famous art school in Spain. And he's there for a little bit, but he doesn't love it. He's kind of gets bored, basically. So he's only there very briefly, but he does like going to the Prado. And he goes to the Prado and sees all these different gallery exhibitions and different works by masters. He particularly likes Velázquez, who we talked about previously. Okay, in 1900 he goes to Paris for a while. He meets some artists and writers there. Then he goes back to Madrid for a while. He starts a publication there called Young Art, where he is publishing ideas that are new and challenging about the art world. He also draws cartoons that are kind of political. They're very sympathetic to the poor, for example. So he does that for a while. He eventually moves back to France. He then has his blue period from 1901 to 1904. We have what is famously known as his blue period, which we might talk about a little bit later. It's not super relevant to Cubism. Basically, he goes into a depression because his friend dies by suicide, and he paints all these paintings that are mostly of a blue palette. After that, from 1904 to 1906, he has what we call his rose period, and that's exactly what it sounds like. Rather than painting things in blue, he's painting things with lots of kind of rose or pinkish hues. So he's a little happier. This is also when he starts painting a lot of people wearing harlequin costumes. As I said, we might get into this when we're talking about different painting later. It's hard to do chronology in modernism because so many things happen. Okay, and then we come to 1907, we come to this painting. This painting is maybe one of the most important paintings in the 20th century. It's also one of my favorite paintings. It was in that exhibition I talked about last time when I was talking about Fauvism and talking about Matisse. This was the painting that you walk in and see when you go into the Matisse and Picasso exhibition, and it's incredible in real life. The slide doesn't know justice, so I'm sorry. Okay, so let's talk about this. So in this period, he starts getting very interested in African art. There's an exhibition in Paris of African masks, and he goes and he's completely fascinated by this. He also, during this time, is interested in Iberian sculpture. So he's been looking also at Iberian sculpture. So he's looking at work from different areas and is taking in all this visual information. So this is Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, which means the young women, the young ladies of Avignon. Avignon is a city in France. And this painting kind of opens the door to Cubism and to a bunch of radical new ideas about representing space and representing figures. Okay, it's a groundbreaking painting. So this was originally going to look a little different. We have some of the sketches that led up to the design of this painting, and they've x-rayed it, and they can kind of like see areas where he changed things. Basically, it was going to have two male figures originally. One of them, which looked very much like Picasso, so it could possibly have been a self-portrait. And one of the figures was a sailor. One of them is holding a skull, I think, or has a skull sitting next to him. And it was going to be called Philosophical Brothel. So from that, we can kind of infer that these young women are perhaps sex workers, and that's part of the subject matter of this painting. Okay. So there's some anxiety there, maybe, with the idea that there was going to be the skull, with the idea that these women are sort of confrontational. Maybe there's a little anxiety related to sexuality, related to sex, related to sexually transmitted diseases, maybe. There's a lot of things that can be inferred about that title and about the idea that there were going to be male figures in the skull. That part we're not as interested in terms of the history of art. So let's look at what is actually happening in the painting. Okay, so when we get to the finished incarnation of the work, the men have been edited out, there's no skull. We have a simplified room, which is depicted basically just by these forms that look like draperies in the background and a little bit of fruit in the floor. So that kind of makes me and makes people think of still lifes. Remember all the still lifes we looked at that have these kind of nice draperies in the background, and then we have this little arrangement of fruit. So there's something about this that's maybe pulling on that lineage of painting and pulling up this reference idea of what fine art, high art is, and this idea of still lifes and nudes as sort of standby forms in traditional art. Okay, so we have this very simplified space, though. Okay, simplified room with these draperies. We've flattened, the space is totally flattened. The composition presents a new way of representing 5 women in a space, right? And we have these women, but their bodies are not continuous forms, okay? They're fractured into all these different facets, right? And then the fractures are kind of layered on top of each other. but it's disjointed. It has a feel of being disjointed. The forms composing the figures are then they're kind of equally jagged to the background. So the shapes of the drapery are also cut up and are also disrupted and are also kind of fractured and jagged in the same way the bodies are. So that makes it even more flat. It all kind of reads together. So the space in the bodies basically become kind of intertwined in this one plane, right? We also have these figures that are inconsistent in the way they're portrayed, right? So we have these two figures on the right who have these faces that are much larger proportionally than they maybe should be to the body. They definitely, we can see the influence of the masks, the African masks, and these kind of the way the faces are shaped. So we have an inconsistency across the way the forms are being depicted. There isn't sort of a standard representation here. So they also are inconsistent in terms of not just their design and the way they look, but also the vantage point. It kind of looks like her head has been twisted around backwards, right? So we're sort of seeing them from different angles at once. As I said, Picasso is fascinated by African sculpture, and you can see that in these, particularly these two faces, the mask-like faces. The bodies are broken up into ambiguous planes, which kind of suggest this combination of views from different angles that are being seen simultaneously. So Picasso does not show this work publicly for some time. Instead, he shows this work to other painters, just to other painters in his studio. And one of the first people he shows it to is George Braque. And George Braque is kind of, to use the contemporary vernacular, he is shook by this. This totally disrupts his whole way of thinking, the way he thinks about composition, the way he thinks about painting. It kind of blows his mind, okay? So basically, Braque at this time had been painting with the Fauves. He'd been doing very colorful kind of work like Derain and Matisse. But after seeing this Picasso, this is all he can really think about. So together, they start working side by side, and they start talking a lot, and they start working on developing this idea of Cubism. Picasso said around this time when he's showing this painting to other artists that he says, "I paint forms as I think them, not as I see them," which is sort of one of the big threads of Cubism. Is it's very much in the mind and in the knowledge that these things have this three-dimensional shape and how to like take it apart and look at it in a different way. It's a very conceptual movement. Okay, so to develop Cubism and continue with the kind of painting that they were interested in, Braque and Picasso build on Cezanne's work, his interest in investigating form, okay? So this analytical approach leads to the development of analytical cubism. A fun fact about the name Cubism, I kind of love this. So Matisse and Picasso, as I've told you, were great friends but also rivals and had this kind of really interesting competitive kind of friendship. So Matisse is one of the artists that Picasso shows this to. And Matisse is then describing this new kind of painting that Picasso is doing to the art critic Vassel, the guy who made up the term fauve, who called them fauves. So Matisse is talking to Vassel, and Vassel's like, well, what is this Picasso up to? What is he doing? And Matisse says, well, he's making this painting that is painted with little cubes. So Matisse describes what Picasso's work in Cubism is looking like and calls it little cubes. And so then, with that in his mind, when Vassel goes to review the work later, he puts into his review the phrase cubic oddities. So the name of Cubism actually comes from Matisse, who was not a Cubist and was never very interested in it. So it's kind of a fun, I don't know, I like stuff like that. Okay, so another writer at the time, he's a French writer, he's also a theorist, Apollinaire, Willem, I think is his first name, Apollinaire. He goes on to describe Cubism as the art of depicting new wholes with formal elements borrowed not from the reality of vision, but from that of conception. So kind of a more complicated way of saying what Picasso had already said, that he was not painting what he saw, but painting from his mind, right? Okay, let us look at another piece. This is a piece by Georges Braque called The Portuguese. Georges Braque, he is born in 1882. He lives until 1963. He grew up in Le Havre, so this is the same hometown as Monet at the mouth of the Seine. He trains as a decorator and a house painter, which is also what his father did, so kind of an interior designer type profession. He gets a certificate in that. And then he also at this time was taking night classes in his hometown in artistic painting. So he had an interest in that from a young age. He eventually moves to Paris. He goes to Académie Humbert. He paints then with the Fauves for a while, so he was very interested in color and in this new kind of modern vision of painting that's more expressive. In 1909, he starts working with Picasso. This is when Picasso shows him his new work, and they start really kind of digging into this. And while Picasso is really influenced, as I said, by African masks, by Iberian sculpture, and he's also he's a big fan of Gauguin and his use of color and the way he flattens space. Braque was mostly focused and very interested in Cezanne's ideas about multiple perspectives. So that's kind of why he took up with the Fauves, because he thought that they were the ones at the time that were kind of continuing Cezanne's work. But when he sees what Picasso has discovered, he feels like this actually has potential to be a further investigation of Cezanne's work with form. So of developing Cubism with Picasso, Braque says, "The things we said to one another during those years will never be said again, and if they were, no one would understand them. It was like being roped together on a mountain." So they had a very involved relationship in terms of this artistic and theoretical exploration. This painting, The Portuguese, is a painting of a Portuguese musician that Braque saw in a bar in Marseille, and he remembered distinctly this artist and how, as he was playing his guitar, he seemed kind of at one with it, and they were like one form. So he has this memory, and he's thinking of how to portray that in a painting, how those forms could be better portrayed using these new ideas about Cubism. So how he goes about this is he's thinking of this musician and his instrument, and basically he deconstructs the man and his instrument, and then he places the pieces around in this dynamic interaction with the space around them, okay? And all of this is on a flat plane, and he wants to be aware of the flat plane, but also be talking about the depth that existed and how it is dissolving. It kind of feels like he collapses time and space together. So the treatment of light and shadow, you can see in some areas the suggestion of modeling, the suggestion of a value scale to show the three-dimensionality of the forms. But then on top of that, there's transparent planes, so you can kind of have the feeling that you're seeing something below, or that the object is maybe dissolving. The solid forms emerge, and then they kind of evaporate. There's sort of contradictory techniques being used all at once on the same canvas. Basically, to see everything that's happening in this painting, you would have to be able to experience it moving through time as it's created, which is one of the other aspects of Cubism. Part of the investigation of form and this conceptual idea of showing all sides of an object at once is also an idea about time. So Cubism is really painting in the fourth dimension being measured by time. So the idea being that you can experience a three-dimensional object only once you've taken it through time and seen it from all sides. So Cubism is kind of interested in flattening those four dimensions out on a two-dimensional surface. Okay. There are other artists who are working in Cubism at this time. So it's a very influential movement, And basically, I just want to show you a couple of other guys so that it doesn't seem like it's only Picasso and Braque working on this in a vacuum. I focus on them because they're the ones who conceptually kind of invented it and do the most work in its development, but they're not the only ones doing it. There's lots of other people. Most notably, Juan Gris is quite famous, and this I put in kind of because it's sort of funny. This is his portrait of Picasso that he made in 1912. So there's Juan Gris. There's also Jean Metzinger. So this is the woman on a horse, La Femme au Cheval. And so they are two artists who are also involved in this conversation and are also exploring Cubism at the same time as Picasso and Braque. They're just not the part of the, they're not, they're part of the conversation, but they're not the originators, and they're not the people who are coming up with kind of the ideas. Basically, they're utilizing the technique. So this is just to say there are other Cubists who had very successful careers and are important in their own right, just not quite as important. Okay, so that was Analytical Cubism. Let's now talk about Synthetic Cubism. Okay, so this is in a lot of ways it's kind of an opposite approach to the same concept, to put it really simply. Instead of deconstructing a figure or an object by painting all the different pieces of it and flattening them out, so that's deconstruction, right? The idea is that you construct or build the object from dissonant parts. Okay, so rather than breaking it down, you're building it from different materials that represent different aspects of what you're looking at. So it is constructive rather than deconstructive, if that makes sense. Basically, this is collage. This is the kind of the invention of collage, or as it's called in French, papier-collé. Okay, papier-collé literally just means pasted paper. Okay, so one of the big things that comes out of this is this idea of fine art being this thing, high art or fine art being kind of in a bubble or up on a pedestal by itself up here, like it's this precious thing, and using mass-produced objects, mass-produced paper, mass-produced receipts and things like this, using that as materials for the creation of fine art is a groundbreaking idea. Okay, because it's kind of elevating the mundane and everyday objects and materials up to the same level as fine art, as painting and sculpture. This is an idea that comes back around and is highly influential in pop art. So when we talk about the pop art movement, that's kind of the basic concept behind pop art, and it really emerges right here with Picasso and Braque. Okay, so this is kind of the first collage. So what this is, it's also kind of a sort of a joke, not exactly. It's kind of a look at simulacra, which we don't really talk about till much later in postmodernism. But basically, the title is Still Life with Chair Caning. A still life, is composed of actual objects. So you would think that the chair caning, since this is a collage, is the actual chair caning, the woven part of a chair. But it is in fact a photolithograph of the chair caning from a chair. Okay, so it's an image of this thing that it is purporting to be, and that is then pasted in to this collaged piece that has oilcloth included in there, then it has oil paint, and then it has the rope glued on around the outside. Okay, first collage. This is a collage by Braque. So this is, again, papier-collé, which means pasted paper, and here we have different kinds of paper pasted onto a charcoal drawing. One of the things I love about this is one of these pieces of paper has kind of a fake wood grain on it, so it's another thing that's kind of playing with these layers of reality, representing itself as wood when in fact it is a piece of paper. Okay, so from here, like I said, there's another kind of cubism called crystal cubism, which is, I talk about in my notes, but essentially it's cubism that really zeroes in on the super angular aspects of cubism and layering those very sharp angular forms on top of each other. So that is happening, and then we have this piece. So in later years, basically Cubism continues to develop. Picasso continues to experiment with different styles in his practice as well, in his practice as an artist. In the 1930s, Picasso becomes very involved in political issues because his homeland is consumed by this terrible civil war. It's a brutal civil war, right? So this is when he creates one of his most famous and impactful works of all time, Guernica. Most of you have probably seen this before. If you have not, that is okay. That's why we're talking about it. Around this time, he has kind of a famous quote where he says, "Painting is not made to decorate apartments. It is an instrument for offensive and defensive war against the enemy," which is also kind of a new idea. I mean, we see this a little bit, like if you think back to Peter Paul Rubens and his work about war, we've seen pieces that kind of are like in protest of certain movements, but a lot of the work up to this time has been commissioned by patrons, right? So it's if it's political, it's for a very particular patron's point of view. Okay, it's not just in general being used by the artist to express a particular belief. And in some of David's work, we kind of see forays into the political realm, but it's pretty specific for one side or the other. It's not, in this, it's a little different because Picasso is essentially saying that the way work has gone with Impressionism and Post-Impressionism and these kind of ideas is it has become kind of decorative. And he does not think that that is the proper function of art. In my little side lecture on isms, this is what we call instrumentalism. So this is art that is about something other than itself, that has an agenda, that's trying to sway your beliefs one way or the other. Okay, so in 1937, the Spanish Republican government is in exile in Paris. They ask Picasso to make a work for the Spanish pavilion at the Paris International Exposition. He doesn't want to get involved, so he doesn't accept it until he hears about this event. So he learns that Guernica, which is the capital of the Basque region is a region in northern Spain and southern France. So Guernica is the capital of this region. And he learns that it's been completely destroyed and devastated by an air raid. Nazi pilots, acting on behalf of Francisco Franco, he's the general in Spain that revolts against the government and is kind of he's allied with the Nazis. So on his behalf, Nazi pilots go and they just air raid, totally destroy Guernica. They level most of the buildings. There's only like 7,000 people that live there. The air raid happens at the most busy time of day when they knew lots of the people would be out of their homes. So of the 7,000 residents, almost all of them are either killed or badly injured. It's just a devastating thing. Picasso hears about this and he is very upset. And so he decides to make this work, which is this mural-sized canvas. It's very large. It's 25 feet long and 11 feet high. But he makes this work, though it's inspired by what happened at Guernica, and it is titled Guernica, he makes it purposefully non-specific. So it doesn't have specific imagery. We don't see Nazi planes. We don't see any kind of flag or any kind of thing showing us that this is, in fact, Guernica. And the reason he does this is because he wants it to read as a universal outcry, and a universal outcry of grief, of grieving human loss, and also as a condemnation of war. So this is at the time of World War II, and he means for this to be specifically an homage to the people of Guernica, but also to have a broad kind of message about grief and also about the plight of war, essentially. So in this work, we look at some of the imagery here. On the left-hand side, we have this shrieking woman who's holding her dead child. Above her, we have this bull, which Picasso says that this time represents brutality and darkness. On the foreground, on the foreground area of the painting, we have a warrior, a soldier who's being trampled by a horse, who has a broken sword that's sort of useless. There's no way to fight back. And then we have this person coming down from the stairs who holds out a lamp to kind of illuminate and show us all these horrors. So in this work, we see Picasso using techniques from analytical cubism, but he's using them in an expressive way, right? So this isn't just about form anymore. It's taking these tools and techniques that he developed earlier in his career and using them to amplify the expressive quality. So the disjointedness of the Cubist forms makes it feel more startling and horrific, right? Okay. So Cubism also influences sculpture. So this is a maquette. It was eventually to be made out of welded steel plates, but this is the cardboard maquette. So here, Picasso is exploring form and volume by using this cardboard to create a faceted 3D sculpture. And here you can see some of the ideas of Cubism in that we can see the surface of the guitar, but also the interior of the guitar at the same time. So even though it isn't exactly the same because it's a three-dimensional object already, he's taking some of these ideas about multiple perspectives and translating them into sculpture. There are other sculptors at the time and later who are influenced by Cubism. One of them is Julio Gonzalez. He's born in 1876. He dies in 1942. He's a friend of Picasso's, and he's from, his family's from Barcelona, and his family are metal workers, like practical metal workers, like welders. So he has this skill set from where he grew up. So he kind of helps Picasso later to weld and to create some of his own sculptural works. And then Gonzalez gets interested in making forms himself. And so he takes kind of the aesthetic view of Cubism as it's developed in painting, and then he applies it to three-dimensional forms and applies that kind of disjointed aesthetic to his metal work. He's very interested in industrial technology. He's very interested in using new materials that are not previously associated with fine arts and kind of elevating them into the realm of fine arts. Okay. Now, we're going to talk about a couple of other movements that are inspired by Cubism. I'm going to go through them fairly quickly. Again, I'm not going to just read to you, but basically, out of Cubism, we have Orphism, we have this interest in a machine aesthetic, and then eventually we have Futurism. This is all in my notes, by the way, and the slides are there as well. Okay, so color did not play a big role in Cubism, as you've probably been able to tell. We've got a lot of browns, we've got some grays, we've got a lot of kind of muted tones. Robert Delaunay, he's interested in combining the expressive qualities of color that came out of the Fauves and the Post-Impressionists and their exploration of color. He's interested in taking that and combining it with the exploration of form that we see from the Cubists. He doesn't see why they can't go together. He called this work simultaneism, but because he's the Cubist idea of showing things from multiple sides simultaneously, and then he's also thinking about using that form, analytical form, simultaneously with expressive color. But then the critic and writer Apollinaire later dubs it Orphism, after Orpheus, who's a Greek mythological figure. He's a musician, he has to do with dreams. Anyway, so he calls it Orphism, and that's the one that sticks, because he's, the one writing about it. So basically, Delaunay, he owes a lot to his wife, Sonia Delaunay. She's Russian. She's predominantly a textile artist, but she's very well versed in color theory and very interested in color. And so she helps him with all these color explorations and was very influential in his interest in incorporating color into portrayals of modern life, basically. So they experiment together, they have a studio together, and they experiment with color and with cubism and decide that the best solution to representing modern life was to build on cubism, but enrich its approach to representation with both color harmonies and color dissonances to add that expressive color quality to the work. Okay, Fern and Legarre, he is born in 1881 and he dies in 1955. Legarre, he's also interested in expanding on Cubism's ideas to better represent modern life. And at this time, all this reference to modern life, when artists say that, they almost always are talking about technology and machines. That was, modern life is basically code for machines at this time. So basically, his solution was to explore something he called the machine aesthetic. Okay, so he brings the meticulous cubist analysis of form together with kind of broad simplification of form and also kind of a machine-like finish of the design components. So you'll notice his work is very, very smooth. It doesn't have that kind of rough edge to it that a lot of the Cubist work has. So that's this machined finish he's talking about. He also favors kind of tubular and curvilinear type shapes because he thought they suggested like machine parts, like the tubing and things that would be part of machine parts. So he starts working in this way that you can definitely see the influence of Cubism, but it's also a little different and it's definitely a little more designed and a little smoother. Okay. Okay, lastly, let's look at some examples of Futurism. So Futurism is named by the Italian poet Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, and it begins as a literary movement. As we get into modernism, a lot of what kind of becomes part of the artistic and art theory vernacular starts in literary theory. So it starts as a literary movement, and it's quite controversial. It's not my favorite, though I do like some of the works because it's kind of fascist. Futurism is kind of fascism. So basically, it champions war. It's very pro-war, and it champions war as a way to wash away the past and start anew. Marinetti said, "We glorify war, the only true hygiene of the world." So that sounds a little like cleansing, the bad kind of cleansing, like ethnic cleansing is kind of where that seems to go in my brain. The Futurists basically advocated the destruction of museums and libraries, which I am super not cool with. They described anything that's a repository of culture or knowledge, they described all of these as mausoleums. This is dead culture and dead knowledge, and we should just wipe it all away and do things that are just new. They also called for radical innovation in the arts, and were very interested in speed and dynamism and modern technology. Okay, so they're very focused on motion and how motion can be translated through time and space, and how that can be depicted both in two-dimensional and three-dimensional forms. Futurist Painting, a Technical Manifesto, is published in 1910. Giacomo Balla is one of the artists who signs to it. So this painting is probably the most famous two-dimensional work associated with Futurism. And you can see when you look at this little dog moving all its little legs, that they definitely have this interest in motion. And part of this kind of calls back not just to the Cubist idea of form and motion and how the fourth dimension, how time plays into our concept of form, but also if you think back to Impressionism, the idea of capturing that glimpse of motion and the idea of photography and how when you have a slower shutter speed, you can get these kind of weird blurry movements captured. So there are ideas that precede this that contribute to it in work that we've looked at. But basically, the main focus of painting in Futurism is this idea of portraying motion and dynamism. And then when that gets translated into sculpture, into three-dimensional work, like this one by Umberto Boccioni, we have this look at forms in space that's based a lot in ideas about cubism. So here he's showing the form as it moves through space and kind of trying to show it faceted as it would be seen from multiple angles. But at this point, since it's three-dimensional, it's not multiple angles like just going around a stationary three-dimensional object. It's multiple angles as an object moves through time, being portrayed all at once. Okay, so it's like the three-dimensional version of this. And that is Futurism. Okay, this was very long. I will see you next time.